express my gratitude to the God of heaven, the one who is master of all things. I want to express my gratitude for the way he has continued to help us. And, I am speaking for myself, but I think maybe you all might share in this sentiment. I want to thank him for the way he has been helping us to understand his purposes, his ways, for the way he has been opening up his truth to our understanding. Even though I have been a Christian for a long time, I am feeling a sense of special enlightenment as we go from week to week. I feel like, there is a divine hand that is opening up things before my eyes. I feel like my mind is understanding things better. And every morning I'm giving thanks to the Lord when I go to pray. But I am feeling that continually. A sense of why do you do this, Father? Because I know that I'm not worthy of God's blessings. But then I always remember that when you have a good father, he does not ask if you are worthy. He just simply blesses you because you are his child. And so I'm grateful. And this morning I want to continue in the vein that we have been pursuing over the past few weeks. And I want to entitle my presentation this morning, Prophetic Parallels. What I want to do is very simple. I can't be long because I have to run over to the chapel for the next session. But at the same time, what I'm going to do this morning is very simple and straightforward. I have two charts, and all I'm going to do is take us through those charts panel by panel, piece by piece. And what I hope to do is to show us the amazing perfection, symmetry, harmony in the things that God has been doing. Sometimes we look at isolated things in the Bible and we're amazed at how beautifully the truth is expressed. But one of the things that amazes me is when I look at the harmony between different places and different things. That to me is the mark of a master. It's like when I look at something like DNA in science. I'm not a scientist. I wasn't very good at biology in school, but I've taken the time to read a little more widely since I became an adult, and I tried to understand DNA. And my goodness, it's the closest thing I can think of to the wonders of the Bible. Because when I look at DNA and I see how all the parts fit together so perfectly, incredibly, impossibly, it's the closest thing I can think of to the study of the Bible, outside of the Bible. If you have never studied DNA, you don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm telling you, it is something amazing. It is the signature of God in nature. And what I'm seeing and loving is that the Bible has the same kind of signature. It's a perfection and a symmetry and a harmony where everything comes together in an amazing way once you begin to understand it. And so this morning I want to talk about prophetic parallels. And of course, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I would like us to just simply go through these panels one at a time. If we need a Bible verse, I will go to the Bible. But I think basically what I'm looking at is things that we understand. And I won't take too much time to look at actual verses because I think we're going to be dealing with familiar territory. What I really want to do is to show parallels, to show how things fit together in symmetry and harmony. That's what I want to look at. So, prophetic parallels. And I'm just hoping, just give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. All right, thank you, Brother Ken. All right, so prophetic parallels. Now, the first biblical event I want us to begin with is the journey of the Hebrews from Egypt to Canaan. This is something we have looked at in recent times, so everybody here is familiar with it. I'm going to start by laying this down as a kind of template, and we're going to build from there. Now, the first event, this event or this series of events began in Egypt, as we know, and from Egypt, the next thing that happened was that they came to the Red Sea. I'm really looking at the major events or the major partitions of this journey from Egypt to Canaan. They left Egypt, and the next great event was the crossing of the Red Sea. The next thing that happened, and I've put uh, this broken green line under the Red Sea. I've put this here. I'm going to tell you at the beginning. It's because it symbolizes a great change that takes place. As we proceed, you will see why I've highlighted this point. It's a great transition point, a moment when a great change took place. After this, they ended up in the wilderness, and then something else happened. Well, they were in the wilderness for 40 years. Then something else happened. They came to the Jordan River, and this again was a great changing point or a great turning point. So again, I've put that marker there. And the next thing that happened, of course, were that they entered the land of Canaan, where they had like maybe what we would call the mopping up operation that brought them finally to the end of the journey. It was a journey that took 40 years. And if somebody were to ask me to divide this journey into the main components, I know that, maybe some people would talk about water coming from the rock. They would talk about the Hebrews being fed with manna. They might talk about how God sent the quail from heaven to feed them, or the brazen serpent that Moses set up. There are many things that happen, but these things that I have on the screen here, I consider the major events. And these are the events I'm going to build our presentation this morning around. It will be focused on these events. So the next thing that I want to look at is the ministry of Moses and Joshua in relation to this journey from Egypt to Canaan. There may be somebody who is unmuted. I hear a little murmuring in the background. Let me go ahead and just mute everybody just to be sure. Mute everybody. All right. So the ministry of Moses and Joshua. So here's our chart. And then in the journey from Egypt to the Red Sea, Moses was the minister, or Moses was the person in charge. That entire series of events, Moses was the one that God chose to orchestrate or to oversee, to be the leader during this period of time. When they went into the wilderness, it was the same thing. It was Moses also who was the minister. So you have phase one, Egypt. You had a turning point, which was the Red Sea, a transition point, and then they were in the wilderness, and again Moses was the minister. And then you had another transition point or another turning point, and they entered Canaan, and this time Moses' ministry was ended, and there was the ministry of Joshua. So you had phase one was Moses, phase two was Moses, but phase three was the ministry of Joshua. Then I want to show how all of this overlaps with the ministry of Jesus. So this is our chart. Now, Jesus' ministry in the world corresponds to Moses' ministry in Egypt. So while Moses was in Egypt, several things happened, and we're going to look at these things. I believe both of these actually started sometime before Moses began to call the Israelites out of Egypt. I think you can look at a comparison and you can see that Moses, when Moses was born, he was taken out of the water, and he was many years in preparing. Actually, it took him 80 years. At one point, he went ahead of God when he was 40 years old, and he tried to do the thing on his own, and God had to send him back into the wilderness for 40 years. And I think this kind of corresponds to, Jesus being born, and he was waiting for 30 years before God actually called him to the work. So,
David,
yes, Brother Ken.
your chart is no longer up. We're just seeing your home screen.
All right, I'm sorry about that. I apologize for
Right.
that. All right, thank you. Right, so if you look at this chart, you will see that Jesus' ministry in this world corresponded to Moses' ministry in Egypt. I'm looking at parallels now between the ministry of Moses, between the Exodus, and the ministry and the life of Christ. And one of the things that strikes me is how perfect the parallel is. So the next thing that we would expect is that some great change takes place. Just like how you came to the Red Sea in the ministry of Moses, what do we come to in the ministry of Christ? We come to Christ receiving a new life. What do I mean? I mean that Jesus died as a man and he rose from the dead as a new man. He rose from the dead as a last Adam. It was the same person, but it was a different experience. He was the same, and yet he was not the same. He had become a new creation. And in fact, in this new creation, Jesus is referred to as the last Adam. Now, it's interesting, and I want to make the point that Jesus was not, he was not the last Adam until he was born again, until he came back from the dead. I'm not sure if most of us can see that this is true. The new Adam, the second Adam, or the last Adam, is the one who provides life for the new creation. Jesus had no life to give anybody until he died and was raised again from the dead. While he was on earth, he was preparing for this experience, but it was after he died and was raised again as the last Adam that he became a life giving spirit. So when Jesus was raised from the dead, he became the new creation. He had received a new life. And this corresponds to Moses and the Israelites passing through the Red Sea. When they passed through the Red Sea, they died to the Egyptian life forever. They left Egypt behind, and it was symbolized by the Egyptians lying dead on the shore after the waters came back together. The Israelites saw them lying dead on the shore. They had finished with Egypt forever, and the sea marked that turning point. So where did Jesus go next? Jesus Jesus' ministry continued, and it corresponds to Moses' 40 years ministry in the wilderness. Now the parallel is there. Somebody may say Moses' 40 years was a representation of failure because they actually should have gone into the promised land maybe in 2 weeks to 1 month, and then it took them 40 years because they were unbelievers. But whether we like it or not, or whether we understand it or not, Jesus had a corresponding ministry when he went back to heaven, which has lasted for 2,000 years. It corresponds pretty perfectly. For 2,000 years, you might say the church has wandered around in a spiritual wilderness. What has happened in the past 2,000 years? I mean, you went through the dark ages, you went through frustration and futility where Christians have been wondering, where are we? And why are we? And what happens? And what happens next? Nobody understands the past 2,000 years because everything started with a bang when Jesus died. And then he went back to heaven, and lo and behold, there was Pentecost, a great outpouring of power. It looked like everything was about to change, and that even the apostles believed that Jesus would come in their lifetime. But it has not happened. 2,000 years. And if you look at the chart, it corresponds beautifully with the history of the Israelites. It could be because of God's foreknowledge, or was it by design? I think some of it was by design because the church needed time. Christ needed time for his kingdom to develop a history. He needed time to demonstrate what his government is able to do. And so I think that 2,000 years is not accident, and it's not based on the idea that are simply because people fell into apostasy. The whole pattern of this world's history, 6,000 years, and then 1,000 years, it suggests that it is God's design is involved. Anyway, so what happens next? Okay, now we come to the Jordan. In the ministry of Jesus, Something is to happen to correspond to the Jordan. And so Jesus, again, he didn't receive new life. But sometime around the end of the 2000 years, Jesus is to receive a new ministry. I'm going to say very clearly and unapologetically that when I look at some of these things, I am persuaded, I'm more fully persuaded that God started something real with the beginning of the Advent movement. All right? I know there are people who are going to be really upset about this. I don't mean necessarily in this room, but I know there are people who maybe my friends and they don't want to hear anything that touches on Adventism. As far as they are concerned, the whole Advent movement was a mistake and a sham, and anything to do with it, they dump it. But I am desirous of being an honest person. I want to be honest. I don't have any bias towards Adventism or against Adventism. I have a bias for what is true. And so, as I'm looking at some of these things, I'm thinking those crazy early Adventists, they were being led. They were being led because some of these ideas are too strikingly clear for you to mistake it. So if you follow the parallel where Israel crossed into Jordan, if the parallel is really something divinely ordained, then what we could expect is that there is to be a change in ministry, just like how you move from Moses' ministry to Joshua's ministry, and the mark of it was the crossing of the Jordan. Something similar should happen in the history of the church. And what we see is that Jesus didn't have, he gained a new life at the Red Sea crossing. Now, at the crossing of the Jordan, it's not a new life, but it's a new ministry. Jesus' ministry corresponds to Joshua's ministry as they were entering Canaan. What is the event in Jesus' ministry? And that is why I mentioned the early Adventists, because it means that Jesus began a work that corresponds to the work of the most holy place. Now we're going to look at this even more closely as we proceed. But you know, there has been a lot of criticism leveled at Adventism, and I'm saying Adventism because I'm not defending the denomination that is called Seventh Day Adventist. I'm not defending the denomination. There's too much that has been distorted and perverted, and I cannot defend the denomination. I keep saying Adventism because I'm going back to the origins of the movement. Now you know that in the beginning, what they believed was that there is a sanctuary in heaven that has two apartments, and Jesus was working in one apartment for 2,000 years, and then at some point in the recent past, they say 1844, he moved into the second apartment. Now, I am not going to suggest that Jesus was in heaven actually sitting down in one room and then now he has moved to another room. I don't think that is a meaningful or fruitful discussion at all, because it is not about a place where Jesus is sitting. It's about a kind of ministry. Now, if you leave the place out of it, if you leave the geography out of it, and you talk about the work that Jesus does, clearly, when you look at the type of the Old Testament, there are two different kinds of ministry that takes place in the sanctuary. Two different kinds of ministry. There was a special ministry that took place on the Day of Atonement. You cannot look at what happened in ancient Israel, and you cannot deny this. And it means something. And so I believe it's very clear that it represents another aspect of the ministry of Jesus Christ. It makes perfect sense, especially as we go to the book of Revelation and begin to understand Revelation. But I'll say more about this as we proceed. So I want you to look at this chart, and I would really appreciate constructive criticism, whether you want to put it in the chat or this afternoon we talk about it. But when I look at this, I see a perfect parallel between the Exodus from Egypt to Canaan, and Jesus' work from he started in this world until he got into the most holy work. And I see a parallel between the ministries of Moses and Joshua and the ministry of Jesus. The phases match perfectly, even down to the detail that the Israelites were in the wilderness for 40 years, going nowhere. And the same thing happened in terms of the history of the church during the time that Jesus was ministering, from the time he went to heaven until the time we come down to what is called the time of the end. All right, let's move on and look now at how all of this matches up with the sanctuary that God gave them, the history of the sanctuary. Now, let me say at the beginning that many people don't realize, but it is true, and you can see that the sanctuary is not just a place where things happen. It's a place where things happen in a particular sequence, one after the other after the other. And the very layout of the sanctuary, the very way that the sanctuary is laid out, gives you a history of the Christian church, of the ministry of Christ, in a sequence of time. It's a time sequence. You begin outside and you walk inside, and you are traveling a journey that covers time. That's what I want to say. And I want us to look at the chart as I try to highlight this point. The layout of the sanctuary. All right. Now, if you're here this morning for the first time, or if you are new to these ideas, you might not know what I'm talking about when I talk about the sanctuary. So let me just quickly explain what this is. The sanctuary was a place that God told the Hebrews to build for the purpose of worship. What you're looking at on the screen was the yard where they set up this sanctuary. This brown rectangle surrounded by this white line represents the yard or the courtyard. Now, this was a place, the sanctuary was to go inside this courtyard. The brown, let's say the brown represents dirt. That white border represents a curtain that was all around it, a curtain of white linen. Now, inside this yard or courtyard, they built a building. And this building was called the sanctuary. Now, it was made of, well, while they were in the wilderness, it was made of boards covered over with gold, and it was covered over with different colored cloths, purple and scarlet, and the top of it was covered over with animal skins. But it was supposed to be the house of God, the dwelling place. God would come and live inside of this house. And so it was called the sanctuary. Now, this sanctuary was divided into two parts. The first part, that orange looking part, was called, well, it was twice as big as the second part. The second part was half the size. And the first section, the orange part, the first room in this building, it was called the holy place. And then there was another room. You went through the holy place and you went into the next room, and that room was called the most holy place. I just put most holy to save a little space, but it was called the most holy place. So you had the first apartment, which is the holy place, and you had the second apartment, which is the most holy place. All right. Now, in the courtyard, I've removed the labels, but I hope you remember. We have the courtyard, then we have the first apartment called the holy place, and we have the second apartment called the most holy place. Now, in the courtyard, you would enter into this yard from the left. Now, the people could go into this yard when you brought your sacrifice. You entered from the left, and that would have been the direction. That would have been east. You entered from the east. And the first thing you would encounter, and by the way, before we even talk about that, the people could go into the courtyard, but they could not enter the sanctuary. Nobody could enter the sanctuary except the priests. And even then, they could only enter the first part, the first apartment. The priests could not enter the second part. The only person who could enter the second part was the high priest. And he could only do this one day in the year, which was the Day of Atonement. All right. So you enter into this courtyard from the left, and the first thing you came upon was this altar. It was made of brass, and it was where they would sacrifice the animals and collect the blood and burn the bodies and all of that. So this was the altar, the first thing you came upon. The next thing you came upon was a little bowl, maybe not little, it was a bowl made of brass, and in it, it was called a laver, and there would be water in it where the priest would wash themselves. Sometimes when they came out of the sanctuary, sometimes when they were going in, they would wash at this laver. Then after that, now you would enter right at that part where you see the laver. You could enter into the sanctuary, not you, but the priest. He would go into the first apartment, and when he got into the first apartment, on the left side, he would see a candlestick with 7 branches, made all of gold. And then on the right side, he would see a table. There would be a little table called the table of showbread. And on this table, there were 12 loaves of bread all the time. Every week, they would change those loaves of bread. But it always had to have 12 loaves of bread, 1 loaf for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Then directly in front of you, in front of the second apartment, there would be a little golden altar. And that is where they would burn incense. There was a fire burning on this altar that was never to be allowed to go out. It was always to be burning there. All right, so that is as far as the priests could go. Notice the people could go in the yard, but not into the temple. The priests could go as far as the first apartment, but no further. And then now you go to the second apartment, which is where only the high priest can go, and only one day out of the year. And this was in the most holy place where there was one piece of furniture. It was this golden box that was called the Ark of the Covenant. It was made as a place to keep the 10 Commandments. So the 10 Commandments were inside of this golden box, and on top of it, there were carvings of 2 angels. All right, so this is what the sanctuary was like. Now, I want you to look now at how the sanctuary corresponds to the Exodus. So here's the sanctuary again, and let's look at how this corresponds to Moses' ministry. Moses' ministry in Egypt corresponds to the altar, because the altar was where the animals were killed. And remember, it was in Egypt that they killed the lamb the night that they were leaving Egypt. And then you go to the second part of Egypt, and what was that? That was the laver. And what is the laver? The laver represents the water that they passed through before they went into the wilderness. They crossed through water just at that point where you see that green dividing line, green and red dividing line, and they passed through the water and they entered into the next part of their experience. Remember, there are 3 parts. There's Egypt, they crossed the Red Sea, corresponding to the laver, and then they entered into the wilderness for 40 years. This is phase 2 of Moses' ministry. And then, so Moses' ministry includes the place where you have the candlestick, the altar of incense, and the table of showbread. And I would say that those 40 years are what I would call a maintenance ministry. Okay? Why do I call it a maintenance ministry? Because you keep things going, but nothing happens. All that happens during those 40 years is that they keep going round and round and round for 40 years around the mountain. They are going nowhere. They are still under God's care. He's feeding them with manna. He's kind of protecting them from the things that can harm them around, the snakes and the rest of it. But they are going nowhere. But they are still alive and they are still being preserved by God. I would say it's 40 years of futility, but I would also say it's 40 years of God's protection without anything unusual happening. But that is not to continue forever. Things are about to change, because guess what? They come to the next great turning point, the crossing of the Jordan River. And now we come to the final moment where we have corresponding to the most holy place. They have entered the land of Canaan. And now they're under the ministry of Joshua. And you know what is interesting is that the word Joshua is the same word, is the same name that was given to Jesus. Jesus' name is Joshua. but of course in it has been anglicized to be Jesus. The Greeks had it as Yeshua, but it's the same Joshua who carried them into the promised land. And it's interesting that this is also the name of Jesus. So you can see that the ministries of Moses and Joshua from Egypt to Canaan correspond to the journey into the sanctuary, from the courtyard into the first apartment, into the second apartment. It corresponds to the sanctuary and to the different places in the sanctuary compound. It's not by accident, it's by design. The God of heaven designed it so we could have assurance and confidence in the things we believe. Now, how does this correspond to the ministry of Jesus? You already know the pieces, but let's put them together. So here we see Moses' ministry, Joshua's ministry, and the sanctuary. Look at how it corresponds to Jesus' ministry. As I said, Moses' phase 1 ministry corresponds to Jesus' phase 1 ministry, which was Jesus in the world. Egypt for Moses corresponds to the world for Jesus. When Jesus was in the world, it's similar to Moses in Egypt. Then Moses crossed the Red Sea and he was no longer in Egypt. What does that correspond to in the life of Jesus? Jesus died and received new life. And when he received this new life, he was no longer in the world. Just as Moses was no longer in Egypt, just as the Hebrews were no longer in Egypt, Jesus and his people were no longer in the world. Jesus went to heaven and he ministered for 2,000 years in a ministry that kind of is similar to the wilderness, because for 2,000 years it seems like the church has gone round and round. What I will say is that nothing extraordinary happened except one thing, and that one thing happened at the very beginning. And you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the day of Pentecost. Just like it happened in Moses' ministry, they came to Mount Sinai and they received the 10 Commandments. That was the only outstanding thing in the ministries of Moses and Jesus during this period, the day of Pentecost and Mount Sinai. And that was at the very beginning. And then there was the 40 years of futility. There was the 2,000 years when nothing outstanding has happened. And this has lulled many Christians into the mistaken belief that this is how it will continue until the Lord comes. Absolutely not. Because guess what? The Hebrews crossed over Jordan, and this symbolizes that something new is to happen in the ministry of Jesus. Now look again at the elements. Let me go back a little bit. Jesus' ministry in the world. Notice the altar. And what did that represent? That represented Calvary. That's where Jesus died. And what about the laver? The laver corresponds to the Red Sea crossing, which corresponds to the death and resurrection of Jesus. The death and resurrection of Jesus represents a kind of baptism. He died to life in this planet, and he was raised to the new life. So he became the new creation, which is what baptism represents. Then he went into the holy place ministry, and look at the elements that are there. The candlestick, the Holy Spirit is working. The bread, the word of God is working. The altar of incense, prayer is a part of the experience of Christians at this time. So it's a maintenance ministry. The Holy Spirit continues to work. Prayer continues to be a part of our experience. The Word of God or the Bible continues to be a part of our experience. But nothing extraordinary happens except for Pentecost at the beginning. But as I said, things are about to change, because now Jesus goes to the Canaan ministry. There's a new phase of the ministry, and this involves the work in the most holy place, which is referred to as the Day of Atonement. And this again makes me highlight the point that whether they stumbled upon it by accident or whether God was directing them, the early Advent movement, somebody was directing them to look at things that the rest of the Christian world was not looking at. The more I look at it, the more I am struck with the reality that this is something real. It's true. You can't read the Bible and miss it, or you can't study the Bible. You can read, but if you study the Bible carefully and you begin to look at these things, it will slap you in the face. You can't get away from it. Somebody was leading these people and pointing out these things to them. There is another great aspect of the ministry of Christ that is to take place in the end of time. Something he did not do in 2,000 years, something he did not do in the first part of his ministry, nor the second part. There is a third phase of his ministry where he's going to do this thing. Something extraordinary is to happen again. That is what I see the Lord telling us as we look at these things. Now, the final thing I want to look at in this sequence is the sanctuary and the feast days. Let me just remind us of what these feast days were. And maybe for those who might be with us for the first time, there were 7 festivals or feasts that God gave to the Hebrews for them to celebrate during the course of a year. There was a Passover, which was number 1 in the first month. There was a feast of unleavened bread, which was the day following the Passover. There was a feast of the first fruits, which followed. And now I'm going to say something, and I always have to say it publicly when I've made a mistake. Now, I said on several occasions that the first fruits was on the 3rd day after the Passover. You had Passover on the 14th, you had unleavened bread on the 15th, and I said you had first fruits on the 16th. Now, Alfred Myers corrected me on a couple of occasions, and he said it wasn't on the 16th, and I kind of overlooked it and ignored it. But eventually I went and I took a closer look at it, and I realized he was right. He's right. The Passover was indeed on the 14th. Unleavened bread was indeed on the 15th. But first fruits depended on when the following Sabbath would happen. Sometimes Passover would be on the first day, sometimes second day of the week, sometimes third or fourth or fifth day. But whenever it happened, what they would do, they would wait until the Sabbath comes, and then the day following the Sabbath would be the first fruits. When Jesus died, it happened to be on the 3rd day after he died. But it wasn't always that way. It was always after the Sabbath. And then you would have 50 days until Pentecost. Now, I just wanted to make that correction because whenever I'm wrong about something, I want to be very clear so that we can correct the mistake. I don't want to know that I misled people and then the mistake is out there. So I want to make sure we correct that. The next thing that happened was that there was Pentecost, which was 50 days after the first fruits. And then you had trumpets, which was the first day of the 7th month. Everything is on a time except, first fruits. You can't quite pinpoint first fruits. And depending on first fruits, then the rest follow in a sequence. Trumpet was the first day of the 7th month. The Day of Atonement was 10 days later on the 10th day. And the Feast of Tabernacles was on the 15th day of this 7th month. Now, there's something else I want to put in as well, which is that yellow line, and you probably know what that line is. That yellow line is a gap. Between Pentecost and trumpets, there was a gap of about 3.5 to 4 months when nothing happened. And of course, if we are looking at the feast as a timeline, which it is very clear they are a timeline, then those 3.5 months, they represent a gap when nothing is happening in between the feasts. All right, you will see what I am highlighting as we go to the next series of charts. So again, here we have our chart with the sanctuary, and we see the ministry of Moses and the ministry of Jesus in the courtyard. And this corresponds to feast number 1, the Passover where the lamb died. It happened in Moses' ministry the night before they left Egypt. It happened in Jesus' ministry the day that he died. And it represents that altar. And at the altar is where we had the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That is where, well, maybe not exactly at the altar. Maybe it should be between the altar and the laver, because Jesus was in the grave and the Israelites were on the journey out of Egypt by that time. So you had the altar, which was the death of the lamb. Then you had the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which represented that they had died. They had left the path of sin behind. The Egyptians were leaving Egypt. They had gone out. Jesus, the same thing. He was leaving this world. He had gone out of this world, not yet out of it, but on the way out. He was dead and in the grave. The trials and the troubles of this world were behind him. That's what the Feast of Unleavened Bread means. The pathway of sin was left behind. The third feast would take us to the Red Sea or the new life. And of course, that would be the Feast of the First Fruits or the wave sheaf. This represented the resurrection of Jesus. It was the time when the Israelites would take the first part of the flock of the field, the first fruits of the harvest. They would take the first part of the harvest and they would bring it before the Lord and wave it before the Lord. And it represented that the first part of the human race had been delivered. Jesus Christ, as the first human being, was saved, taken up to God, and his people, in a sense, were taken up with him. It begins a brand new experience for Jesus and for the church. And so, what about that experience? 40 years in the wilderness, 2,000 years. As I said, the next thing that happened was the day of Pentecost. Right at the beginning of the wilderness experience, the Hebrews were given the Ten Commandments. And we know the Ten Commandments corresponds to the giving of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. The law was written on stone in Moses' ministry. In the ministry of Jesus, the law was written in the hearts of his people when Jesus came to live inside of their hearts. The first part of his ministry, the first thing he came to do was live inside his people. The first part of Moses' ministry, the first thing that happened, they were given a set of instructions as to how they should live, exactly corresponding. Where do we go next? The next thing that happened was the blowing of trumpets, number 5. So where are we? We're at the Jordan, the second crossing, the receiving of new life for Jesus, a new ministry. Not new life, I should have new ministry. It's a mistake there. In the ministry of Jesus, it was a new ministry, not a new life. So, what does this correspond to? It corresponds to the blowing of trumpets. The blowing of trumpets is a message that is to go to the world, making the world aware of the new ministry of Jesus Christ and of the new experience that his people are about to enter into. That is the experience of the Day of Atonement. You have to go to the book of Revelation to obtain the details about this work. So this corresponds to the crossing over at the Jordan, the beginning of Jesus' final ministry. And now you have the ministry of Joshua in Canaan, Jesus' ministry in the most holy place. And what happens there? Well, everybody knows. It's the Day of Atonement. And so you see that there is an exact correspondence between the sanctuary layout, the ministry of Moses, the ministry of Jesus, and the feast days. The last feast, the Feast of Tabernacles, it won't fit here. You have to put it outside the sanctuary, because the Feast of Tabernacles is after the sanctuary ministry of Jesus is over. After the feasts are done and fulfilled, there's no more sanctuary. We have passed through the phase 1, we have passed through phase 2, we have finished phase 3, and now we are in heaven. That's number 7. And so you can see, I mean, when I look at this, I'm lifted up into heavenly places. I am amazed. I can see how the Lord has given us things to cement our faith, that we can believe with all our hearts in what is happening, even though we may not be able to see with physical eyes. The pattern is so beautiful and so clear. You can have no doubt that there is a divine hand that has put these things in place, and we God's people have every reason to have absolute confidence that we are standing on the verge of eternal things. It is so amazing when you look at it. Now, I have about 10 minutes left, and what I'm going to do, I'm just going to look at this whole thing that we just looked at. I'm going to look at it from another perspective. I'm just going to go through a chart very quickly, but I think sometimes by going back over something from another perspective, it helps to cement it in our minds. So that's what I want to do. Like I said today, We're not necessarily having a study where we look at Bible verses, but I think everything that is before us here, all of us can see and understand the biblical beauty of it because everything is based on the Bible. So, what I want to look at now is the same history, same things we just looked at. On the left side, I have type, and on the right, I have antitype. In the first column, I will look at the feast days in type. In the middle column, I will look at where this took place in type. And in the third column, I will look at who was the minister in type. Then on the right side, I will look at the same things in the antitype. And just in case you're a completely new person, you don't know what type and antitype is. Type means that something is set up in the Bible as an illustration or as a pattern. And antitype is the fulfillment when this thing actually took place in real life. The reality of it took place. That is the antitype. All right, so first feast was Passover. What was the antitype? The antitype was the crucifixion of Jesus. It was when Jesus was put to death. All right, so you can understand the pattern we are going with. Okay, where did the Passover take place? It took place in Egypt. Where did the antitype take place? It took place on earth, actually at Calvary, but it was on earth. Who was the minister of the Passover type? It was Moses. Who was the minister of the Passover antitype? It was Jesus, but specifically, it was the human Jesus. It was not Jesus in the heavenly ministry. It was Jesus as a human being who was ministering during the time that these events were happening on earth. He was a minister. He was a person. It was his role as a human being, or his identity, his existence as a human being. The next feast was the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And this one also took place in Egypt. This actually was fulfilled in antitype when Jesus was in the grave. He had escaped from sin, just as the Hebrews were escaping from Egypt. They were on the way out of Egypt. And this again for Jesus in the antitype took place on earth. And again, the person who was involved was a human. I keep jumping to the wrong place. The minister was Moses, and the minister in the antitype was a human Jesus. Then you see I have a thick orange line because now we move to the transition place. We are moving to the next phase of ministry, part 2. Remember, there are 3 parts: on earth, in the second section, and then the third section. Now, this feast would be which one? The feast of the wave sheaf, or the first fruits. And it corresponds to Jesus' experience in the resurrection. Where did it take place? In Moses' ministry, in the type, it took place at the Red Sea. In the antitype, where did it take place? It took place when Jesus was ascending, his ascension, the change from this earth to heaven. The minister here was Moses. Who was the minister in the antitype? No longer the completely human Jesus. Now it is the second Adam. Jesus has become a life-giving spirit, a quickening spirit. His identity has changed. His nature has changed. He's no longer simply human. He's now the second Adam. He's now immortal. There's a change. The next feast was the feast of Pentecost. And the antitype in the ministry of Jesus was the giving of the Spirit. Jesus was made a life-giving spirit, and he poured out his life upon his church, upon his people, and the Spirit was given. Where did this take place for Moses? It took place at Mount Sinai in the wilderness. Where did it take place for Jesus? He was in the holy place. Now, as I said, I'm not saying he was in that apartment. I'm saying he was doing the work that corresponds to that apartment. So pouring out of his spirit corresponds to the first apartment, ministry, the place where the candlestick was with the 7 branches. Who was the minister in the type? It was Moses. In the antitype, who was it? It was the second Adam. Jesus was the second Adam when he gave the spirit. Then you come to another transition point. Bright orange line. We come to another change. We come to phase 3 now. Phase 1, Moses. Phase 2, Moses. In the work of Jesus, phase 1 was the human Jesus. In phase 2, it was the second Adam. Now we come to phase 3, and we have now the feast was the blowing of trumpets. In the experience of the antitype, what was this? This was the beginning of the pre-Advent judgment. If you have been with us looking into the prophecies of Revelation, you understand exactly what I mean. It's a message that begins at that point, and it grows. It is to intensify as we see the crisis breaking. As a matter of fact, it has not really broken out fully into the blowing of trumpets, I don't believe, but it corresponds to this time of the judgment. Now, where did this happen in the type? It happened as they were entering the land of Canaan. When they entered Canaan, and the first place they attacked was Jericho, when they blew those trumpets. And where does this happen in the antitype? It happens as Jesus has moved to the most holy. There's a work taking place now that corresponds to the most holy. The minister at this point is no longer Moses. Moses' ministry of Mount Sinai and the Passover cannot take Israel into Canaan. Mount Sinai and the Passover cannot take them into Canaan. It needs Joshua's ministry. In the same way, the death of Jesus and the giving of the Spirit at Pentecost is not enough to prepare the church for what is about to happen for us to actually enter heaven. There has to be the work of Jesus as the high priest, or what is referred to as the Day of Atonement experience. The church is to reach a place of perfection, and Calvary did not accomplish it, and Pentecost did not accomplish it. There is an experience called the Day of Atonement involving the ministry of Christ, where this perfection is to take place. It involves a final work of Jesus Christ. Look at the pattern, brothers and sisters, and you ask yourself, how can we miss it? The next feast was the Day of Atonement, of course. I just talked about it. And it refers to the perfecting of God's people. Sin is removed. The memories, the habit patterns are taken away from God's people. A miracle, just like Pentecost was a miracle. There's a miracle that happens. Anybody thinks that this is fanciful. You don't believe in the power of Jesus Christ. You don't believe in the work of God. He will take away those things from our experience. Where does this happen in type? In type, it happened in Canaan. Where does it happen in the antitype? It happens in the most holy place, in the ministry of Jesus, corresponding to the most holy place. And of course, Joshua is the minister, and Jesus as high priest is the minister. Then the final feast is the Feast of Tabernacles. What does that correspond to in the antitype? It corresponds to God's people being fully delivered. What does this mean? In the type, it means that they are settled permanently in the land of Canaan. In the antitype, it means that God's people are finally in heaven, fully delivered, body, soul, and spirit. That is the Feast of Tabernacles. Who is the minister? It was Joshua who was the minister. And here now, who is the antitype? Who in the antitype is the minister? It is Jesus as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Well, I'm not going to be able to hang around today to talk about it much and to take all the comments and the questions, because I have to go to the face-to-face fellowship this morning. But all I'm hoping and praying, brothers and sisters, is that we all have been able to follow what I've been saying. And if you have followed, I'm sure that, like me, you're kind of a little bit blown away to see the perfection of what God has laid before us. I mean, everything is in the Bible. It's there, brothers and sisters. It's just that sometimes we don't put things together the right way. And I'm not blaming us. I'm not blaming me. God has a time that he begins to open people's minds. God has some things that are shut up and sealed, and there's a time when God opens them up. He is an amazing, wonderful Father. And I think the very fact that we are seeing some of these things is saying to us, God's time has come. It is time to take off our shoes, because the place where we are standing is holy ground. So, Thank you all for the fellowship and the cooperation.